Imagine you are a British Marine sentry on the gun deck of a 64 gunship of the line. 3 hours before dawn, September the 7th, 1776. Your ship is HMS Eagle. She is the flagship of Admiral Lord Richard Howe, and beneath her rides the largest amphibious force the British Empire has ever assembled in the Americas. 130 warships and transports. 30,000 professional soldiers waiting to break a rebellion. The night is cold. Water slaps the hull. Somewhere on shore a rebel campfire glows and dies. You are, by every measure any admiral has ever used, absolutely safe. You are not. 22 feet directly beneath your boots, a Connecticut infantryman named Ezra Lee is turning a hand crank inside a wooden egg. He is exhausted. He is running out of air, and he is trying to screw 150 pounds of gunpowder into the bottom of your ship. Before sunrise, the Royal Navy's 200-year assumption that a ship at anchor in a defended harbor, protected by guard boats and thick wooden walls, is untouchable, will be dead in the water. Not a single sailor will die that night. And that is the strangest part of the story. Because the humiliation was never supposed to be measured in bodies. It was measured in something worse. So how did a farmer with no naval training, no shipyard, and no navy build a weapon that terrified the greatest fleet on earth from beneath its own keel? If you had asked anyone at the time, anyone at all, on either side of the Atlantic, the answer to that question would have been the same. It could not be done. The sea belonged to Britain, and it belonged to her, absolutely. A quick note on the name over this story, because military history viewers deserve honesty about it. The dramatic label Yorktown 1776 is how this weapon is remembered in the popular imagination. But the primary sources are precise. The Turtles' combat mission, the night that changed underwater warfare forever, happened in New York Harbor, 5 years before the siege of Yorktown, Virginia. What follows is not the surrender of Cornwallis. It is the earlier, quieter humiliation that made men in Cornwallis's navy afraid of the water beneath their own ships. And the two are connected in ways we will come to. Now, the conventional wisdom. In 1776, the Royal Navy had spent a century perfecting a single, unshakable doctrine. Warships, fight warships. Fireships and drifting mines were known nuisances, easily spotted, easily deflected with a boat hook and a shove. A ship at anchor, ringed by picket boats, with lanterns burning and lookouts posted, was as close to invulnerable as any weapon of war had ever been. There was no such thing as an attack from below. There was no doctrine for it. There was no watch order for it. There was no name for it. In every British naval manual of the age, the space beneath the hull was empty geometry. It was where fish lived. It was not where enemies came from. And on the American side, the picture was, if anything, worse. Continental forces around New York had no ships of the line, no frigates, barely a coherent shore battery. Charles Lee, one of Washington's senior officers, and half the general staff considered the idea of mechanical trickery against the Royal Navy to be a distraction from serious soldiering. When a shy provincial older student from Yale, a farmer's son who had submerged gunpowder in glass jars for fun, proposed sending a single man in a wooden capsule to blow up an admiral's flagship, the polite response was that it was the fantasy of a man who had read too many pamphlets. The impolite response was unprintable. They had no idea what was coming, because if this worked, if a hand-cranked wooden egg could crawl beneath the Eagle and detonate her keel, then everything Britain believed about her own supremacy at sea was a lie. Every anchored ship in every harbor from Boston to Bombay became a target. Every admiral asleep in his cabin became a man dangling above an invisible knife. The stakes were not the fate of one ship. The stakes were whether the strongest navy on earth could ever again believe its own hulls were safe. So how did a farmer almost prove them wrong? David Bushnell was born around 1740, on a hardscrabble farm in Saybrook, Connecticut, the eldest son of a man who owned rocky soil, and not much else. For the first 3 decades of his life, David Bushnell did what eldest sons on New England farms did. He plowed, he mended fences, he carried water. He did not go to school beyond the basics, and by every account of the neighbors who knew him, he was odd, quiet, private, prone to disappearing into the woods, with peculiar wooden contraptions he refused to explain. When his father died, Bushnell sold his share of the farm to his younger brother. He was in his early 30s, and instead of buying land, or a wife, or a share in a trading vessel like a sensible Connecticut man, he did something that, in the 1770s, was very close to unthinkable. He walked into Yale College and asked to be admitted as a student. He was nearly a decade older than the boys around him. He had no Latin, he had no Greek. He had, as George Washington himself would later put it, no advantage from education, either classical or scientific, a line preserved in Washington's own hand in a letter to Thomas Jefferson written in 1785. What Bushnell had, instead, was a single obsession. He wanted to know whether gunpowder could explode underwater. In 1775, every European authority on chemistry and gunnery would have told him no. Powder needed air. Powder needed a dry match. Powder underwater was wet powder, and wet powder was mud. Bushnell did not believe them. He sealed small charges inside corked wooden casks. He weighted them. He sank them in a Connecticut pond. He ignited them by a flintlock trigger connected to a length of wire. And when the pond leapt upward in a column of white water, Bushnell wrote down in his own careful, deliberate handwriting the sentence that would eventually be read aloud to the American Philosophical Society. I found that gunpowder, when confined and ignited underwater, would explode with nearly the same effect as in air. That sentence is the seed of everything. But here is the wound at the center of David Bushnell, the human contradiction that makes him more than a name in a footnote. He was a man who had proven, alone, by candlelight in a pond, that the whole logic of naval warfare could be inverted. And he was constitutionally incapable of standing in a room and telling people so. He was shy. He was secretive. He worked in the dark, literally and figuratively, and he trusted almost no one with the details of what he was building. His own brother, Ezra Bushnell, was to be the operator of the machine. When Ezra fell ill in the summer of 1776, David did not have a second trained man ready. He had built the future of war, and he had built it as a solo craft, because David Bushnell did not know how to work with a crowd. The genius and the wound were the same trait. The mind that could solve underwater blast alone in the woods could not build a team, and that would matter in a wooden egg at 3 in the morning more than anyone imagined. Admiral Lord Richard Howe was, in 1776, 50 years old and one of the most respected naval commanders in the British service. He had earned his reputation the hard way. At sea, in the 7 Years' War, a battlefield commander who understood ships and understood men. He was not stupid. He was not arrogant in the personal sense. His own officers found him quiet, careful, even melancholic. But he was the product of a service whose entire self-image rested on a single sentence. The Royal Navy is master of the sea. By late August of 1776, Howe sat at anchor in New York Harbor with a force that, on paper, made the American rebellion look like a bookkeeping error. Roughly 130 ships. A ship of the line, Eagle, with 64 guns, more firepower in a single hull than the entire Continental Army possessed. His brother, General William Howe, commanded 30,000 professional soldiers ashore. There were, in Howe's field of view every morning, more British troops within musket range of Manhattan than there were rebel soldiers in the entire New York theater. The math was not close. The math was contemptuous. And here is the flaw that David Bushnell was, without ever meeting Richard Howe, designing his machine to exploit. Howe's fleet anchored in tight, orderly lines. Every night at the same time, in the same water, with the same guard boats rowing the same patterns. His sentries watched for fire ships and swimmers. They did not watch the water beneath the hull, because in 200 years of Royal Navy doctrine, no one had ever attacked a ship from beneath its hull. The space between a keel and the seabed was, in the mind of every British officer alive, an empty room. Bushnell had turned that empty room into a corridor, and Howe did not know it existed. By the last week of August, 1776, everything was in place for a collision that no one on the British side could see coming. Washington's army had been mauled on Long Island. New York was about to fall, and moving quietly by cart and small boat, hidden under canvas, past pickets who never asked what was in the crate, an object roughly 7 feet tall and shaped like 2 turtle shells, fastened lip to lip, was making its way toward the East River. Inside it was 1 seat, 2 hand cranks, a compass illuminated by phosphorescent fungus, and a screw designed to bore into the underside of a warship. Ezra Bushnell, the trained operator, David's own brother, was supposed to climb inside it. He never did, because in the last week of August, Ezra Bushnell fell ill, and the entire secret weapon of the American Revolution suddenly had no one to fly it. Before there was a mission, there had to be a machine. And before there was a machine, there had to be a moment, one small, unwitnessed moment, on a cold Connecticut river in the spring of 1776, when a shy older man climbed inside a wooden capsule he had built with his own hands, sealed the hatch above his head, and let the water close over him. If it leaked, he drowned. If the ballast tank failed, he drowned. If the pumps jammed, he drowned. If the air ran out before the mechanism came back to the surface, he drowned. David Bushnell had built a device for which no manual existed, because no such device had ever existed. He had no rescue plan. He had no diver in the water above him. He had a brother somewhere on the bank, watching a patch of dark river for the moment. A curved wooden top broke the surface, and a hatch swung open and a man climbed out alive. There was no version of this test that was safe. There was only the version where the idea worked, and the version where the idea killed its inventor. We are about to walk, step by step, through exactly how this machine functioned, the geometry of it, the physics of it, the human beings crammed inside it. Because you cannot understand what happened under HMS Eagle unless you first understand what a farmer from Saybrook was actually asking a wooden egg to do. Here is what he built. Picture 2 enormous tortoise shells, made of oak, joined lip to lip along the horizontal. That is the outer shape. Roughly 7 feet tall from base to crown, roughly 4 feet wide at the middle, reinforced by iron bands wrapped around the wood like barrel hoops. Every seam sealed with tar and oakum, the same caulking used on ocean-going ships, applied by hand and pressed into the joints with the obsessive patience of a man who knew that a single leak at depth meant death. This is the Turtle. It is not a boat. It is a capsule. There is 1 seat inside it. Just 1. The operator sits nearly upright, knees drawn up, head just below a small brass conning tower, crowned with thick glass ports. When the vessel is fully submerged, those ports are underwater, and he sees nothing. When the vessel rises so the crown breaks the surface, those ports become his only window on the world. Now, how does it move? Bushnell designed 2 hand-cranked propellers. One is horizontal, mounted on the front of the vessel, geared to a shaft the operator turns with his hands. Crank it forward, the Turtle moves forward. Crank it backward. The Turtle moves back. The second propeller is vertical, mounted on top, and turning it drives the vessel up or down through the water. Add in a rudder controlled by a tiller against his hip, and the operator has, in principle, full three-dimensional control of a machine that is, in practice, about as fast as a determined man can swim. 1 knot, 2 knots at absolute maximum, slower than the tide. Depth control is handled by a ballast tank set into the base of the vessel. Open a valve, water floods in, the Turtle sinks. Work a foot pump, water is expelled, the Turtle rises. And there are lead weights held to the outside by a lever that can be dropped in an emergency to send the whole craft rocketing back to the surface in seconds. This is the escape system. This is what saves the operator's life if everything else fails. For navigation, Bushnell faced a problem no one had faced before. A candle inside a sealed capsule would consume the operator's oxygen in minutes. So he did something extraordinary. He gathered foxfire, the phosphorescent fungus that grows on rotting logs in New England woods, and mounted glowing pieces of it beside the compass and the depth gauge. The compass needle sits in a faint greenish ghost light. The depth gauge, a simple column of water rising against a pressure marker, glows softly beside it. The operator flies his machine by fungus. And now the weapon itself. Fixed to the outside of the Turtle, on the upper rear, is the magazine, a sealed oak cask containing roughly 150 pounds of gunpowder. Enough, if it detonates in direct contact with a wooden hull, to blow a killing hole in a ship of the line. The magazine has a clockwork timer connected to a flintlock. Wind it, release it, and the flint will strike the pan roughly 1 hour later. But, and this is Bushnell's most ingenious touch, the magazine is not simply left drifting. It is attached to a screw auger, a wood-boring bit mounted on top of the turtle, cranked by the operator from inside. He drives the turtle up until the auger touches the enemy hull. He turns a handle. The auger bores into the hull planking. He releases a lever. The turtle detaches. The magazine stays behind, screwed into the ship's underside, its clock already ticking. That is the plan. Attach, detach, retreat, detonate. 1 man, 1 egg, 1 hour, 1 hull. Which brings us back to that cold Connecticut river in the spring of 1776, and to a wooden egg bobbing low in the water with David Bushnell inside it. Or perhaps his brother Ezra. The sources are not certain who was inside on which day. What the sources are certain of is that the trials happened, and that they happened one at a time, alone. The first thing the operator learns is the sound. There is no silence inside the turtle. There is the creak of oak flexing under pressure. There is the squeak of iron fittings shifting in their brackets. There is the pump, when he works it, hissing water back into the river. There is his own breathing, immediately louder than it should be, because the space is small and the walls throw the sound back at his face. And beneath all of it, once the crown drops below the surface, there is the muffled, alien roar of a river he can no longer see. He works the ballast valve. Water flows in around his feet. The turtle settles. He watches the depth gauge glow faintly in the foxfire light. 2 feet down. 3 feet down. 4. His stomach lurches at the sensation of the whole world tilting upward around him. He is now beneath the river. The compass swings. He steadies it. He begins to crank the horizontal propeller. Slow, laborious turns. His shoulders burn within 30 seconds. The turtle inches forward through the water, at a pace slower than a walking man. He cranks. He cranks. He cranks. And on the bank, if anyone were watching, and no one is, because the whole point is that no one is watching, the river would show only a faint ripple, no wake, no shape, nothing. He works the vertical propeller. The turtle rises. He watches the gauge. 2 feet, 1 foot. The crown breaks the surface. He can see, faintly, through the ports, the dark shape of the far bank against a slightly less dark sky. He is not lost. He can navigate. He submerges again. And this is the moment where the whole thing becomes something more than a curiosity, because he does the same maneuver in reverse. He turns the turtle. He cranks his way back toward the launch point. He rises. He orients. He submerges. He cranks. He rises again. And then at the end of it, and this is the number that no one before David Bushnell had ever produced, the hatch opens and a man climbs out, wet and shaking and gasping and alive. The idea works. That is the sentence you have to sit with, because in 1776, that sentence should not have been possible. Every principle of contemporary shipbuilding said a wooden vessel small enough to be crewed by 1 man could not be made watertight against pressure. Every principle of contemporary chemistry said gunpowder detonated underwater was mud. Every principle of contemporary naval doctrine said the space beneath a hull was empty, geometry, unused, unusable, unreachable. And here, in a Connecticut river, a farmer from Saybrook had alone disproved all 3. Now, think about what he does not have. He does not have a shipyard. He does not have a naval architect. He does not have an engineering journal to publish in. He does not have a patron rich enough to fund a fleet of these things. He has 1 machine, 1 prototype, 1 shot. If it works in combat, the political and psychological consequences are staggering. If it fails in combat, the Royal Navy will laugh, Washington's critics will be vindicated, and the whole idea of asymmetric underwater warfare will be set back by a generation. There are no second attempts. There is no second turtle waiting in a shed. There is this 1 wooden egg, and there is 1 operator, and there is 1 flagship in the harbor. And there is a limited window before the British seize New York, and the American army loses its launch point entirely. Washington in Manhattan is briefed. He listens. He nods. He, who as recently as 10 years earlier would have laughed anyone with such a scheme out of his headquarters, gives the order. The Turtle is going to war. The Turtle is carried by cart at night, under canvas, from Connecticut to the American positions near the East River. It moves the way secrets move, slowly, unmarked, past pickets who assume it is a barrel of salt beef or a cask of powder or someone's wardrobe. It arrives. It is hidden. It is guarded by men who have not been told what it is. Ezra Bushnell, David's brother, the trained operator, the man who has spent months learning the cranks and valves and pumps of this machine, is preparing for the mission of his life. And then, in the last week of August, Ezra Bushnell falls ill. The sources are quiet about what it was. A fever, most likely. The New York summer of 1776 was murderous with disease. Whatever it was, it laid him flat. He could not stand. He certainly could not crank a propeller for 2 hours while starved of air and steering a wooden capsule under enemy guns. The only man trained to operate the world's first combat submarine was on his back, sweating, useless. And the British fleet was not going to wait. Now, before we go into the harbor, before we meet the man who actually climbed into that machine, this is a good moment to say something. If military history storytelling is something you love, the kind that walks you into the mechanism instead of past it, then consider staying with this channel. What comes next? The man they picked in a panic, the crossing, and the moment beneath the Eagle when the whole plan collided with something no one had accounted for, is where this story stops being clever and starts being terrifying. They needed a submariner. They did not have one. The trained operator was in bed with a fever. The inventor was, by his own admission, too physically weak and too socially peculiar to pilot his own creation into combat. The clock was running. The British fleet was tightening around New York. If they waited for Ezra Bushnell to recover, the Turtle would be launching against a British-held harbor with British sentries on the American shore. So they picked a soldier, not a sailor, not a diver, not a mechanic. A soldier, an infantryman from Lyme, Connecticut, 27 years old, with a musket and a knapsack, and a jaw set in the way that men who have been chosen for something impossible tend to set their jaws when they realize saying no is not a real option. His name was Ezra Lee, and history will remember him as the first man to attack an enemy ship from underneath. He had, at most, a few days of training. He had never operated a hand-cranked propeller. He had never controlled buoyancy through a ballast tank. He had never navigated by a Foxfire compass in total darkness. He was, in every meaningful sense, the wrong man for this machine. He was also the only man available. And here is the mini-question this movement answers. Everyone who has ever heard of the Turtle knows the mission failed. Everyone knows the Eagle was never sunk. But almost no one asks the harder question, the interesting one. How did an untrained infantryman in a leaking wooden capsule, cranking through a harbor full of British warships in the pitch dark, get all the way under the flagship of Admiral Howe without a single sentry seeing him coming? That is what this movement is about. Not the failure, the impossible success that came before it. Here is what Ezra Lee had to do to disappear. The Turtle's stealth was not magic. It was geometry, physics, and a very specific exploitation of 18th century British watch discipline. Let us walk through each piece. Piece 1, Silhouette. When the Turtle was trimmed to neutral buoyancy, only the top of the brass conning tower, roughly the size and shape of a large dinner plate, showed above the waterline. In daylight, this would have been visible at 50 yards. At night, in a harbor churning with the wakes of guard boats and the reflections of stern lanterns from 100 anchored ships, that brass plate was indistinguishable from a floating scrap of debris. There is no ship wake to give it away, because the propulsion is subsurface. There are no oars, no sail, no engine sound. It is a piece of driftwood, if any lookout notices it at all. Piece 2, Timing. The mission launched in the small hours of the morning, after midnight, before dawn. British watch schedules rotated at this hour, and more importantly, sentries who have been on deck for 4 hours in cold September damp are not scanning the water at maximum alertness. They are shifting foot to foot. They are thinking about the end of watch. They are looking outward, toward the shore, toward where a threat is expected to come from, because a threat has never once, in the history of the Royal Navy, come from anywhere else. Piece 3, approach angle. Lee did not need to sneak past every ship in the fleet. He needed to reach one. HMS Eagle was anchored in a position visible from the American shore, roughly 1 to 2 miles across the harbor water. She was the target because she was the flagship, and she was reachable because she sat where she always sat, night after night, in a fixed and known location. The British had, without meaning to, given Bushnell a stationary target. Piece 4, subsurface navigation. Once Lee was within a few hundred yards of Eagle, he was going to submerge. He would use the vertical propeller to drop below the waterline by 4 or 5 feet. He would keep the horizontal propeller turning at a slow, steady pace. He would rise every so often, just enough to bring the ports above water, just enough to check the black silhouette of the flagship against the slightly less black sky. Just enough to correct course. Then down again. Rise. Correct. Down again. He would move like a swimmer taking a breath. Brief, unlit, unnoticed. Piece 5, the tide. This is the piece that is either brilliant or nearly fatal, depending on the operator's skill. The tidal currents in New York Harbor run strongly. A skilled operator uses them, letting the current carry the turtle toward Eagle while he steers rather than fights. An unskilled operator gets swept past his target, or into another ship, or out to sea. Ezra Lee, remember, is the unskilled operator. He has had days, not months in this machine. He is going to be doing the math in real time, in the dark, while his shoulders burn and his lungs work harder and harder against thickening air. Piece 6, the human factor Bushnell could not design around. Air. There is no rebreather, there is no oxygen tank, there is only the volume of atmosphere inside the sealed capsule when Lee closes the hatch. And however long it lasts. Best estimates suggest 30 to 60 minutes of usable air before the operator becomes hypoxic, before his thinking slows, his hands shake, and his judgment begins to fail. The entire mission has to happen inside that window. Attach, detach, retreat, detonate, 60 minutes, one breath at a time. It is roughly 2 in the morning, September the 7th, 1776. 2 American whaleboats, oars muffled with rags, pull the turtle out into the East River. Ezra Lee is already inside the capsule. He has been inside it for perhaps 20 minutes, waiting, listening to the muted grunts of the rowers above and around him. His hands are on the cranks. His feet are on the ballast pump. The foxfire on his instrument panel glows faintly green. The whaleboats stop. Lee feels a jerk as the tow line is released. Voices above him call out a whispered farewell. Then oars pull away, and Ezra Lee, 27 years old, farmer's son from Lyme, is alone in the harbor. He begins to crank. The first thing he learns, immediately, is that Bushnell's estimates of speed were optimistic. 1 knot, 2 knots. Words on paper. Inside the machine, cranking with everything his arms can give, he feels the water fight him. The tide is with him. Bushnell timed the launch for that, but even riding the current he is barely making progress, a man could match by walking. His shoulders are on fire within 3 minutes. He shifts to the other arm. The turtle drifts, corrects, drifts again. He rises. The crown breaks the surface. Through the glass ports, dark shapes. He counts masts. He can see riding lanterns, small yellow pinpricks against the black. The fleet spread across the harbor, each ship marking itself for him without knowing it. Eagle is somewhere in that constellation. He picks his star. He submerges. Cranks. The rhythm becomes a kind of trance. Turn. 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 Breathe. Turn. 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 20 minutes in, the air is already noticeably worse. It is not that he is choking. It is that every breath is somehow less than the last. One in a way he cannot quite name. His face is wet with condensation from his own breath. Water pools around his boots. A slow, worrying leak somewhere he cannot find. He pumps. The pump wheezes. Some of the water goes back into the harbor. He rises again, and now he can see it. The Eagle, the flagship, 64 guns, 250 crew, a mountain of oak and canvas and iron, riding at anchor, so close he can see the individual gun ports along her side, closed for the night, and the faint glow of the great cabin lantern in her stern. He submerges one last time, and this is the moment, right now, in this cranking, breathing, sweating, hypoxic instant. Ezra Lee is doing something no human being has ever done before. He is closing the last 100 yards of an underwater attack on an enemy warship. There is no doctrine for this. There is no history for this. There is only him and the crank, and the black water, and the shape of the world's greatest navy directly above him. The turtle bumps, gently. A soft wooden knock. He has drifted into something, the anchor cable maybe, or the hull itself. He panics for half a second, then steadies. He works the vertical propeller. He rises a foot, and through the ports, when the crown breaks the surface, he can see directly beside him, curving upward and away into the night, the flank of HMS Eagle. He is under her. He submerges again. He is directly beneath the flagship of Admiral Lord Richard Howe. 64 guns of imperial power sitting on a foot of harbour water above his head, and not one of the 250 men aboard has any idea. The Marine sentry from the opening of this story is somewhere directly above Lee's brass conning tower right now, listening for footsteps on the deck and hearing nothing. The officer of the watch is drinking cold coffee, 200 feet away. Admiral Howe is asleep in his cabin, and beneath all of them, in a wooden egg lit by fungus, an exhausted infantryman is bringing the screw auger into position to bore a hole into the bottom of the British Empire. The plan is working. The plan is actually impossibly working. He has crossed a harbour full of guard boats undetected. He has found the flagship in the dark. He has positioned himself directly beneath her keel. He is in exactly the place David Bushnell drew on a piece of paper 8 months earlier in a Connecticut farmhouse. All he has to do now is turn the screw. He reaches up. His hand finds the auger crank. The mechanism is directly above his head. A simple wooden handle geared to the metal bit that protrudes through the top of the turtle. He takes a breath. It comes short. He takes another. Shorter. The air is going. He turns the handle. The auger bites upward against the hull. And something is wrong. He can feel it in the resistance. He can feel it in the way the mechanism strains and does not bite. The auger is designed for wood, for oak planking, for the soft underside of a ship of the line, for the kind of surface every warship in the world has presented to the sea for 200 years. And whatever is above Ezra Lee's head is not answering the way wood should answer. He turns the handle harder. The mechanism groans. His shoulders scream. Somewhere above him, in the dark, there is a bright metallic scrape, the sound of iron trying to bore into something that does not want to be bored. The world's first combat submarine has arrived exactly where it needed to be. Undetected, on schedule, under the flagship. And the flagship is refusing to be attacked. We are about to walk through in exact detail what stopped that auger, what the primary sources actually say, what modern naval historians think really happened, and how a failure at this specific moment produced paradoxically the psychological victory the mission is remembered for. Because the story is about to turn on a piece of metal none of the Americans knew existed, an oxygen deficit that was about to change a man's judgment, and a decision made in 90 seconds that would ripple in ways no one that night could have imagined, all the way to Yorktown 5 years later. Every technology has a moment when reality reaches up and puts a hand against it. For David Bushnell's turtle, that moment came at approximately 3:15 in the morning on September the 7th, 1776, when Ezra Lee's wood-boring auger encountered a surface it was not designed to penetrate. There has been debate ever since, for 2.5 centuries, about what exactly was above Lee's head. Bushnell himself, writing 11 years later for the American Philosophical Society, said the operator struck iron sheathing. That was his word. Iron. Modern naval historians, when they look at the archaeology, push back. The Royal Navy in 1776 did not typically sheathe hulls in iron. It sheathed them in copper, thin sheets of it, hammered over the underwater planking to prevent shipworms and marine growth. Copper is softer than iron, but copper is not wood, and an auger designed to bite into oak planking will not bite into copper, or into an iron-reinforcing strap near the rudder mount, or into whatever specific piece of metallic hardening that Ezra Lee, in the dark without a diagram of the enemy's hull, happened to press his bit against. This is the mini-outcome for this movement, and I am not going to hide it from you. He does not get through. The Turtle does not attach its magazine to the Eagle. The flagship of Admiral Howe is not blown up. The plan, on the level of its stated objective, fails. But here is the deeper question, the one this movement actually answers. Why is the Turtle remembered then? Why do naval academies still teach this attack? Why did British sailors, for years afterward, quietly hate looking at the water beside their own hulls at night? The answer is what happened in the next hour. To understand why the auger failed, and why the failure mattered less than it should have, you need to understand three interlocking things: the physics of the boring problem, the physiology of the operator, and the psychology of the pursuit. First, the physics. The screw auger on top of the Turtle was, essentially, a modified carpenter's tool. A helical wood bit, driven by a hand crank, geared to provide enough torque to bore through several inches of ship planking. Ship planking in 18th century construction was oak, hard, but predictable. The auger's cutting edge was hardened iron, sharpened to bite fibrous wood. Now put a sheet of copper, roughly a 32nd of an inch thick, between that auger and the wood. Copper is not thick, but copper does not shatter, and it does not tear the way a fibrous material tears. It deforms, it smears, it clogs the cutting edge of the auger. And if what is above the auger is not copper alone, but a copper sheet backed by an iron reinforcing plate, as it might well have been near Eagle's rudder mount, where structural hardware was concentrated, then the auger is trying to cut through a laminated metal surface it was never designed for, from below, upward, against gravity, powered by one exhausted man in a sealed capsule. It does not go in. Second, the physiology. Ezra Lee has been inside the Turtle for over an hour at this point. The air, by any reasonable estimate, is now bad enough to affect judgment. Hypoxia does not feel like suffocation at first. It feels like fog. Decisions come slower. Fine motor control degrades. The instinct to keep trying, to make one more attempt, and one more, is exactly the instinct hypoxia strips out of you first. Lee is not thinking clearly. He knows he is not thinking clearly. And he knows, or believes, that if he stays under the Eagle for another 20 minutes, he will pass out beneath her keel, and his corpse, in a wooden egg, will be found by the British at dawn, and Bushnell's entire secret will be captured intact. He shifts position. He tries a different spot on the hull. The auger still will not bite. He tries again. Currents nudge the Turtle. He is losing his grip on the geometry, on where exactly. Above him, the ship even is any more. His compass tells him one thing. His depth gauge tells him another. The Foxfire is dim now, dying. He makes the decision. He is going to abort. Third, the psychology of what happens next. Because here is the extraordinary piece. When Ezra Lee finally releases his ballast and rises toward the surface, dawn is coming. And when the crown of the Turtle breaks the water, British lookouts on nearby ships see something. Not clearly, not identifiably, but something. A shape wrong in the water. Boats are launched, small pinnaces rowed hard, cutting toward whatever this thing is. Lee cranks. The Turtle limps. And now the mechanism of the mission changes. The plan was, attach, detach, retreat, detonate. That plan is dead. The new plan, forming in Ezra Lee's oxygen-starved brain, is different. If he cannot use the magazine as a weapon against Eagle, he can use it as a weapon against the pursuit. He can lighten the Turtle by dropping it. He can let the clockwork keep ticking, and when it goes off, near the pursuing boats, or between him and them, or anywhere the British can see, he can turn a technical failure into a psychological detonation. He reaches for the release lever. He pulls the lever. There is a soft, mechanical thunk above his head. The sound of a heavy oak cask, packed with 150 pounds of black powder and a clockwork flintlock winding down inside it, detaching from the top of his machine. The turtle, suddenly 150 pounds lighter, jumps in the water. Lee feels the surge. He cranks harder. The vessel accelerates from 1 knot to something slightly better than 1 knot, but for a man in his condition, in a chase, every fraction matters. He rises again, just enough. Through the ports, in the greying pre-dawn light, he can see the British boats, 2 of them, maybe 3, oars pulling hard, closing the distance. He can hear voices now, thin across the water, shouting to each other in the unmistakable clipped English of Royal Navy discipline. They see him. They cannot make out what he is, but they see him. And they also see, drifting free behind him, a dark shape in the water. The boat crews slow. This is the moment. This is the moment where whatever the turtle was going to become, in the memory of the Royal Navy, is being decided. Because the men in those pinnaces cannot see a submarine. Nobody has ever seen a submarine. What they can see is a cask, floating on the tide, receding on the current. And they know what a cask in the water near a fleet means. Every sailor knows. Fire ships, powder kegs, infernal machines. This is the 18th century sailor's oldest nightmare. The drifting thing that goes bang. They back their oars. They do not at first know whether to pursue the turtle or investigate the cask. They shout at each other. Lee cranks. The tide is now carrying the magazine away from the fleet, toward the wider harbour, and Lee is putting distance between himself and the British boats, with every burning shoulder rotation. He rises once, briefly. He sees the boats still hesitating. He submerges, he cranks. And then, somewhere behind him in the harbour, David Bushnell's clockwork completes its final revolution. The flintlock releases. The flint strikes the pan. The spark takes the priming powder. And 150 pounds of sealed, dry, confined gunpowder, exactly the kind Bushnell had proved would burn under water, exactly the way Bushnell had said it would, ignites. The harbour lifts. The witnesses vary in their accounts of exactly what they saw. The water column has been described, in later retellings, as anywhere from 20 to 100 feet high. The primary sources are less theatrical and more useful. There was a large explosion. Water was thrown into the air. It was heard across the harbour. It was heard aboard the flagship. Admiral Lord Richard Howe was awakened by it. Every sentry on every deck of every ship in the anchorage turned toward the sound. And what they saw, when they looked, was nothing. No burning fire ship, no enemy vessel, no attacker. Just a column of water settling back into a dark harbour, and no explanation for it whatsoever. That is the moment the story turns. Because for every officer in that fleet, for the Marine sentry on Eagle, for the officer of the watch, for the captains of the anchored frigates, for Admiral Howe himself pulling on his coat in his cabin, the mystery of that explosion was, in some ways, worse than a direct attack would have been. A fire ship you can identify. A cannonade you can locate. This was invisible. This came from the water. This proved that something Britain did not understand was operating beneath her own ships, and had apparently just tried to blow one of them up. The British boats never caught the turtle. Lee reached the American shore in the growing light, was hauled out of the machine barely conscious, and had to be revived. The turtle, the world's first combat submarine, had made its first combat return. Its operator had survived. Its inventor's design had performed exactly as designed, in every respect except one. The piece Bushnell had not accounted for, the thin sheet of copper or iron between an auger and its target. Meanwhile, in the harbour, British officers were writing hurried reports about an infernal machine seen in the water at dawn. They did not know what it was. They did not know how many more there were. They did not know whether the fleet was, at that moment, being stalked by an entire school of invisible wooden creatures with bombs on their backs. They did not sleep well that night, or the night after, or for many of them, for a long time. Not a single British sailor died. Not one plank of Eagle was cracked. By the accounting of muskets and dead men that every 18th century commander used to measure a battle, David Bushnell had lost. By any other accounting, he had done something no one in the history of warfare had done before. He had proved, in front of the greatest navy on earth, that a farmer's son from Saybrook, working alone in the dark with a wooden capsule and a clockwork bomb, could reach under the flagship of an admiral and detonate 150 pounds of gunpowder in the water beside it. The mission failed to sink a ship. The mission succeeded, permanently and unrecoverably, in destroying an idea, the idea held by every European navy for 200 years, that a warship at anchor in a defended harbor was safe from below. That idea died in New York Harbor at dawn on September the 7th, 1776. Ezra Lee lived. The Turtle, after 2 more failed missions in the following weeks, was eventually lost when the sloop transporting her was sunk by British cannon. David Bushnell went on to build floating mines that would, months later, damage British shipping on the Delaware and terrify sailors up and down the American coast. And the ripple from that single night in New York, the ripple from an untrained infantryman, an unbroken hull, and an unattached bomb, would travel further than anyone that morning could imagine. Let us start with the accounting no one wants to write about, because it is the accounting that made the Turtle, for 200 years, look like a footnote. In the immediate campaign, nothing changed. Admiral Howe's fleet remained anchored where it had been. HMS Eagle continued to serve as flagship. Within days of the attack, British forces launched their assault on Manhattan, drove Washington's army north, and captured New York City, which they would hold for the rest of the war. On paper, the Turtle mission accomplished nothing. The numbers make the point brutal. The British force in the New York theatre in September of 1776 was, by conservative modern estimate, around 30,000 professional soldiers ashore, and somewhere between 130 and 150 naval vessels of every class in the harbour. Against that, David Bushnell had built 1 wooden capsule, crewed by 1 exhausted infantryman carrying 1 bomb. The math is not close. The math is absurd. Bushnell attempted 2 further Turtle missions in the weeks that followed, targeting other British vessels in the Hudson. Neither succeeded. In October, the sloop carrying the Turtle was hit by British cannon fire and sunk. The world's first combat submarine went to the bottom of the river. Bushnell later claimed he recovered the machine, though what he recovered may have been little more than salvage. It never returned to service. There would not be another submarine attack anywhere on Earth for almost a century. By every conventional measure, Bushnell had failed. Not 1 British sailor was killed. Not 1 British ship was damaged. Not 1 operational decision of the New York campaign was altered. And yet, here is the strange thing about weapons that succeed as ideas rather than as machines. The Turtle did not sink Eagle, but every officer in Eagle now knew that a rebel colony had built something that could crawl beneath a warship in the dark. The British Admiralty received reports through the autumn of 1776, describing machines and infernal contrivances and mysterious explosions. Some were the Turtle, some were Bushnell's follow-up mines, some were rumors amplified by fear. All of them, taken together, produced a shift in how the Royal Navy thought about anchorage security. Guard boat patterns changed. Watch discipline tightened. Officers began, quietly, to look at the water beside their own hulls in a way they had not looked at it before. Now, the larger ripple. In the summer of 1781, 5 years after the Turtle mission, a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse defeated the Royal Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake, cutting off Cornwallis at Yorktown. Bushnell was not there. His machine was not there. The trap that finished the war was sprung by a conventional fleet action of the kind Bushnell could never have contested. But the strategic logic that made Yorktown possible, the logic that Britain's naval dominance, was not absolute. That ships in the wrong place at the wrong time could be caught. That Royal Navy assumptions about their own supremacy could be exploited. That logic had been foreshadowed one September night in New York Harbor, and in the long generations after, the ripple grew. In 1864, an inch-thin submarine called the H.L. Hunley, built by Confederate engineers, would carry a spar torpedo across a harbor and sink a Union warship, becoming the first submarine in history to sink an enemy vessel in combat. Every naval academy that teaches the Hunley traces its lineage backward to the German U-boat prototypes of the 1890s, backward to Robert Fulton's Nautilus, and backward, always, to a wooden egg in a Connecticut river, piloted by a shy older student who had proved gunpowder could burn underwater. None of that lineage exists without Bushnell. None of the underwater history of naval warfare, a history that in the 20th century would come to define entire wars. None of it happens without one man in Saybrook who did not believe the experts. Ezra Lee returned to conventional army service. He fought at Brandywine. He fought at Monmouth. He lived to see the Revolution won. He died in Lyme, Connecticut, in 1821, and his gravestone, quietly, describes him as the first man to attack an enemy ship from beneath the water. David Bushnell served out the war in the Continental Army's Corps of Sappers and Miners. Afterward, in a decision the sources cannot fully explain, he moved south under an assumed name, David Bush. He practiced medicine. He taught school in Georgia. He never married. He never returned to Connecticut. He died, quietly and largely forgotten, around 1824. The man who invented modern underwater warfare ended his life anonymous in a rural county that had never heard of the turtle. The turtle is now considered, by universal historical consensus, the first combat submarine in the world. It is studied at the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. It is discussed in the training curriculum of every submariner in the American service. Its principles, buoyancy control by ballast, propulsion by internal mechanical crank, attack on the enemy hull from below, are the direct conceptual ancestors of every submarine ever built. It is worth pausing on how strange that lineage is. The nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines of the 21st century, 300-foot steel tubes carrying enough firepower to end a civilization, are the direct descendants of a wooden egg piloted by fungus light and hand cranks. Every design principle of the modern submarine service, stealth from below, delivery of explosive ordnance to a hull, use of ballast tanks for depth control, was proven, however imperfectly, on the night of September the 7th, 1776. And there is Washington's line, preserved in his own hand, in a letter written to Thomas Jefferson, 9 years after the Turtle mission, when critics were still mocking Bushnell as a crank. Washington's judgment, precise and generous both. I then thought, and still think, that it was an effort of genius. And elsewhere in the same letter, in the same clean handwriting, the sentence that has kept Bushnell's name alive when almost nothing else did. A description of him as a man who by his own application and study, without any advantage from education, either classical or scientific, had made himself master of one of the most useful branches of mathematics. Washington could have let history forget Bushnell. He chose, in that letter, to nail the reputation to the wall. If you want to see the turtle now, there are two places to go. Neither is glamorous. Neither has the crowds of Gettysburg or Yorktown. The first is the Connecticut River Museum in Essex, Connecticut, not far from Saybrook, where Bushnell was born. A working reconstruction of the turtle sits inside the museum, built to Bushnell's specifications from his own written descriptions. It is smaller than you expect. You look at it, and you cannot quite believe a full-grown man fit inside. You cannot quite believe that anyone, having built such a thing, would then climb into it and close the hatch over his own head. The second is the Submarine Force Museum in Groton, Connecticut, home port of the modern American submarine fleet. There is a turtle replica there too, and it sits in a curatorial gesture whose quietness may be the most powerful thing about it, in the same building as the USS Nautilus, the first nuclear-powered submarine in history. 200 years of underwater warfare, from oak and foxfire to enriched uranium, standing under one roof. The harbor where the attack happened, the East River off Manhattan, is now covered in bridges, container ships, ferries. There is no monument in the water. There is nothing to mark the spot beneath which, on a cold September morning in 1776, one exhausted man in a wooden egg turned a hand crank against a copper hull, and in failing, changed war. Here is what David Bushnell understood, 3 centuries before the rest of the world caught up. He understood that empires are not defeated only by bigger empires. They are defeated by ideas the empire cannot see. The Royal Navy in 1776 could count every ship on the horizon and shoot every one of them out of the water. What it could not count, and could not shoot, was the space beneath its own hulls, the empty room in every admiral's mental map. Bushnell walked into that empty room with a wooden egg and a clockwork bomb, and he made the world's greatest navy afraid of its own bathwater. He did not sink a ship. He sank a certainty, and every submariner in every ocean since has descended from the man who did it. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the mechanism, the human beings, the moment where the impossible almost worked, subscribe. New military history every week. And tell me in the comments which forgotten weapon of the American Revolution you want next. The chevaux de frise chained across the Hudson, Knox's cannon dragged 300 miles in the snow, the floating mines Bushnell built after the turtle. Pick one. I read every comment, and the story that gets the most votes gets the next film.